Hi, everybody. I'm Joseph Vogely of Stokely Films. I'm the co-writer, the director, and the creator of the new slasher sensation Specimen 6. And I am joined here today on a very special episode of our new podcast. Mariana, what is our podcast name, and who are you?
I'm Mariana, and this is No Country for Joe and Mariana.
Yes, and we have a really great episode right now for you guys. We love to talk about all sorts of stuff that are in the popular culture, but the one thing that we love above all is horror-themed, horror genre-related things. And so often we talk about movies, but today we thought we'd do a little special thing where we actually talk about horror video games, because horror video games have really been around, since the inception of the video game itself. People just love it. I know that I've seen even pinball games from back in the 70s that were horror related, back on some of the early Commodore 64. Is that what they used to be called?
Ghostbuster, Commodore 64.
All the way back then. So we've had in the early Nintendos, we had Castlevania and Ghosts and Goblins. Those two are some of my favorites. I'm not a particular expert in this genre. I play them occasionally when I see one that looks really cool. I really enjoyed the Evil Dead games when they had Bruce Campbell doing the voice and everything. I played all of those. And that's the thing in the news, Bruce Campbell just announced that there will be a new Evil Dead game that he is voicing. And I believe it's supposed to be a virtual reality thing, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. Cool. But if you can show up with the boomstick and you are the man himself, Ash, that's where I want to be. I might even go out and buy a VR set just so I can play that game. I'm really excited for that. Before we get into this, I want to introduce everybody here. So, again, we have a very special guest, David Newton, who you might remember from Black Gravity Films. We talked a little bit about his work as a filmmaker and a musician. Dave, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you, Joe?
I'm doing wonderful. My nipples are very perky. James.
Hey.
So James has a stream. He is a professional video gamer. He does streams every single week. He's always talking to his friends and his fans that like to watch him play video games. Mariana and myself have actually jumped in on one of his streams on a Friday night, and it was a lot of fun. We just watched him play video games, and we talked and bullshitted and stuff. I believe we watched you play that video game that's right behind you there. What game is that, James?
So this game that's playing behind me is called Dead by Daylight, and it's actually one of the more popular horror games that's been out in the market right now. And yeah, it's actually one of the games that I didn't actually know anything about this game until I watched other streamers play it. Then I started realizing how much fun it was, where you can be the survivor or the killer, and it made me buy the game but there was no marketing for it whatsoever. But just watching other people play it made me want to play it, and I think that's what's super important about without having to advertise anything, right?
So we're going to talk a little bit more about that game in this episode. I want to get to our new guest here, Lucas, who is also a video gamer himself, and he plays lots of other board games and whatnot. He is an aficionado of many genre types. So, Lucas, how are you doing today? Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. I've been playing games for many years, dabbling in all sorts. But it was horror that actually got me started. I got lent a copy from my uncle of Resident Evil 1.
Oh, nice.
So it's his fault, really.
Well, perfect. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So, yeah. So we will be talking a lot about the Resident Evil games. I've played a little bit of them myself, so I've seen the movies. I'm excited for the newer movies that are supposed to be coming out. Let's talk a little bit about what we've been watching recently. So just TV shows, movies, things like that, and maybe video games that we're playing. So Mariana, have you seen anything that recently that you're excited to tell people about?
Actually, yeah, and Lucas kind of turned me on to this. It's What We Do in the Shadows. They're just incompetent vampires, and it's really amazing. I really enjoy it. There is one part I don't enjoy, Joe.
What's that?
It reminds me of you. There's this episode in the second season, and it's called Ghosts. I'm not going to say much about the episode. I'm just going to say that there is a doll that comes to life. No,
She's looking at
my
you, Maria.
bane of my existence.
She sees
Dolls.
you right there. You gotta watch it. Sometimes she's a little scamp. Sometimes she runs away and just kind of finds herself in places. I never know what she's doing. She was just hanging out next to me because she wanted to look at Nadiana right now.
When I was talking to you with Danny and Maria, and I said, "Where is she?" You could not find her, and I
Yeah, no,
really believe she ran off by herself.
she ran off somewhere. I found her. Yeah, I found her shortly thereafter, but it definitely wasn't where I had put her. So.
That actually reminds me of a story that one of my friends is incredibly afraid of Chucky, right?
Yeah.
So as the great friends that we are, we bought him Chucky as a Christmas present, and the actual doll itself, right? And what happened was that he was so freaked out of the doll that he put it like in a barrel with like stuff over the lid, right? Like that's how scared he was. And he wasn't joking. He's actually afraid of this thing. And so we played a prank on him. We actually snuck in his house, took the doll out of the barrel. And so we went to his house the next day, be like, "Hey man, where's our doll at? What happened to it?" He goes, "Well, I put it in this barrel." And I was like, "Oh, let's go check." And it was gone. He was like, "Oh my god, it's missing." It was the whole time. So we had to confess that we took it. It was pretty funny.
Back when Lucas and I lived together, he went to, I think it was a trivia or something, and he won. What doll was it?
Yeah, the villain from that neighbor game, where he's like a Satanist with a really like broad chin.
Oh, was that Hello Neighbor?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
But I come home one day and he's not there, but the TV is on, and I see over my desk, I can see this orange trucker hat. And I'm like, Lucas doesn't wear trucker hats, but there's obviously a hand holding the remote. And I was like, oh, well, it's kind of short. It might be one of his nephews maybe came to visit or something. I come around, and there's this creepy-ass doll with a remote in its hand watching TV. And then he hid it on purpose in the closet that I go to every day.
Yeah, this doll kind of looks like a Buff Flanders from The Simpsons.
So I wanted to, before we started going there, and I love that story, the movies that I've been watching, I rewatched because I watched these movies because I think it was stuck in my head. I rewatched the first 3 Insidious films, which I really love. And I think there's some really great haunted, possessed films by James Wan. James Wan directs the first 2. So I rewatched those. I thought those were great, but it really has stuck in my mind because in the news, Jason Blum of Blumhouse actually said there's a possibility, and they're thinking about this right now, of taking the Insidious franchise and merging it with the Sinister franchise, which is the monster that they see in the film, and it comes out and it kills them and everything like that. So it's a little in the rumor mill. I don't know how true it is, but I sure hope it is true. Yeah, so
possibly kind of living in the same what is that, universe, right?
Universe, yeah, kind of Blumhouse universe. Maybe it's the same as like the Paranormal Activities and stuff too. Yeah. I'd be really excited for that. Dave, what movies have you been watching recently?
I finally got to check out Invisible Man.
Okay.
It was okay. I think Kevin Bacon makes a much scarier Invisible.
Yeah. Oh, and Hollow Man? Yeah.
Yeah, and Hollow Man.
Yeah, he's definitely gross in that film. I like that film.
Yeah.
Christian Slater is in part 2, just to say, folks.
It's like the same person. Isn't it? I mean, I thought they were the same person when I was a kid. They look kind of the same.
Okay, James, what have you been watching?
Ironically, that you, Lucas here, brought up Resident Evil, because I watched like 4 Resident Evil movies last weekend.
Oh, wow.
Like in a row.
Yeah,
and I was hooked. I was like, man, these movies are terrible and they're great. Like, I started actually with Resident Evil 2 because I saw the first one like 4 times, right? And second round through it, I actually enjoyed it a lot more because I took it less seriously.
Yeah.
But I dabble in filmmaking, and Joe knows this from our history together. There was a few things in there that I would probably change, especially with the games, in relation to the games and how close the source material was, right? Mm-hmm. But I won't take up a lot of that. I think it's funny, and I think it's good that they made the movies like in the world of Resident Evil, and not the games, because that would have been harder to write. And I think that was a smart move on their behalf. But they used a lot of the source material from the games in the movies.
It's very kismet that you brought that up, James, because I just in the news I was reading that there's a remastered version of Resident Evil 3 which will be coming out very soon here from Capcom, and from my understanding, everybody's really excited for it because they really enjoy the remasters of 1 and 2. But there won't be any additional material, but it's supposed to look really beautiful. What is your opinion on these remastered Resident Evils? Because I know you really probably play the shit out of them, so did Lucas from the originals. So what do starting with James and then into Lucas. James, what do you think what is your opinion on these remastered copies of old video games?
Got it. Well, in this case, and I'm just gonna throw this out there. There's a difference between a remake and a remaster, right? These new Resident Evil games, Resident Evil 2 remake and 3 remake, are done in the fashion of Resident Evil 4. And Lucas can attest to this, is that the first Resident Evils you're like more so like a third person on this map. You're solving puzzles, right? And the controls are super clunky, and that's the part of the charm of the game, right? These new ones, the camera is right behind your character over the shoulder. They're a little bit more action packed, right? There's more mobility, but the immersion is much better, right? Because of technology and the graphics. You are definitely more immersed in the world of Resident Evil with the games now. But the way they've changed is more like like I said, they're more action packed because they're trying to cater to the more general crowd. But the spirit of the game is still there, just because they follow the source material really well. And I think what really makes it important to new gamers and also the older ones like myself is that when we were young, these guys were just pixels on a screen, and you had to read the words on the screen, right? But now there's like emotion behind these characters. You can hear them talk, and without the bad acting, unfortunately, because I like the bad acting. But they now have more emotion behind them, and I think like that's like super amazing to be able to kind of like live through as a gamer the first iteration of the game and then the revisioning with better technology, right? So I would ask you, Joe, like, if you had an older movie that you'd want redone because now we have the technology to do that, what kind of movies would you like to be remade? Like, for example, I know there was an older Captain America movie, right? And so I seen that when I was a kid. And, back then you're like, that's the best they can do. And you're like, that's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, the rubber ears and everything.
Yeah, exactly. So like, as an older adult that's still a nerd, watching a newer Captain America movie with CGI and better filmography, right? Cinematography. You're just kind of like, wow, like this is like way more impressive than back then, right? So, but it's still the context of it's still the same, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think? Would you kind of what's your take on that?
Yeah, I guess because I'm a film guy. So as far as remakes go, I'm not opposed to remakes at all, so long as they have the creatives who are behind it have their own particular vision, and it's a strong vision. It's not just trying to dumb it down. So say I'm Friday the 13th guy, right?
Yeah.
I love all of the Friday the 13th. I have Jason Voorhees on my chest. I watch those constantly throughout the year. Really, I mean, I even get a little weepy sometimes when I think about Jason Voorhees killing people. It's just who I am. And so before the remake came out in 2009, I think, I had seen all of them, and I was still excited because I just wanted to see Jason up on the screen. I'm always a little reserved, but I showed up with a lot of excitement, and I wasn't let down. Some people shit on him because they just don't like remakes. They get that in their mind that, it's just not as good as the original. Well, because you're looking at something as you're comparing it to the original, but really when it comes down to it, it's a completely different film with a completely different artistic vision. Yeah. You can't and I'm also a theater guy. I came from the theater myself, and I guess you can take this analogy for what it is, but you don't always see the same performance on stage of Macbeth, do you?
Mhm.
So different directors, different actors bring their own interpretations to the material, and I kind of see it that way. So sometimes you wind up with a shitty remake, and so I'll base it like the Nightmare on Elm Street remake was just trash. And what they did there was they dumbed it all down, they watered it down, and tried to make Freddy Krueger this sympathetic character. It didn't work. It just wasn't, and all the kills were lame. The great thing about the Nightmare on Elm Street films were how inventive they were with their dream world and how they killed people and how Freddy always appeared differently in different ways. Like I was talking in a different podcast about Freddy showing up in Dream Warriors, which is part 3. And so this guy's about to is in this dream, and he thinks he's going to have this great sex with this big boobied nurse, right? And I remember when I watched it as a kid, and I thought, oh, that I love that scene. I rewatched it over and over. But at this one point, he's just about to get it on, and I think any young person who has a predilection for big booby nurses can attest to this. Where if you're dreaming in such a way, you're just about to get there, and all of a sudden something happens, or you wake up. You're like, no, I want to get back there. I want to get back there. But at this particular moment, the nurse becomes Freddy. So now you got Freddy Krueger with his big old pair of boobs, and then he, tries to kill the kid. And so, I mean, it's a little different spin. So, I mean, just as an illustration of how inventive they were back in those sequels, they came out with that remake. It was this watered down kind of shit show. And I didn't care for it, but I didn't care for it as its own endeavor. I thought, I don't look at it as a remake. I think of it as a failed artistic experiment in filmmaking. So remakes I'm all about. As long, like, I love the Halloween remake. People shit on it. I love it. I even love the sequel to that too, because it was Rob Zombie's very specific interpretation and vision of what the Michael Myers films were like. John Carpenter had his own thing, and then Rob Zombie kind of said, hey, I got this idea. I'm going to put it through the Rob Zombie filter, and I love those films. So I'm for them, but I'm not for the bad ones where it just kind of they try to cater to the more mass audience, and so they water shit down, like in the Nightmare on Elm Street remake. However, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake was kind of its own thing in comparison to the original. So, I'm all for remakes.
That's funny that you bring that up, because video games are kind of the same way, right? You're all about film, and I'm all about gaming. And Resident Evil is actually a really good example of what you just said, because I would say up to Resident Evil 5 and 6, the formula for Resident Evil has always been very similar. But then as 5 got released and then 6 got released, they definitely wanted to cater to more of the mainstream crowd. 6 was considered a failure. Just because 6 was very action heavy, but when you play, I'll ask Lucas right now, in the first game, I mean, there's no such thing as an action heavy Resident Evil when you have very little bullets,
right?
So it's all about survival. It's all about managing your inventory, right? And in Resident Evil 6, you were just given an assault rifle and endless waves of zombies running at you, and there's a story in there.
Right? So that's really different than because I've played zombie games where it's like that, but I've played some of the earlier Resident Evil games where it is the survival based, and you run out of bullets, and you have to figure out, you run up to some rooftop or something, and then you're like, I'm fucked. How do I figure this out?
So it's like I said, when you were describing films, I was kind of thinking the same way with video games, and I think the main difference, because most games right now are pretty much movies that are interactive, right?
Yeah.
The main difference is really going to just, one, it's going to be more of a watered down film, and two, you make the decisions of the protagonist in the games, right? So it makes you more immersed. But that's pretty much it. That's kind of what I got out of that.
So I want to stick on Resident Evil for a moment, since we're on that thread. And you brought up the remake itself, and I found this rather fascinating, how you were talking about how the original was so vastly different. So they basically made it a different player engine, I guess, as far as video games go, right?
Yeah.
And then, but they kept the same story. Is that what happens in the?
Yeah, so in Resident Evil 3, the original one, it played like Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 were very similar in formula, right?
Mhm.
You had this big map, you had to explore certain things, solve puzzles, pick up items, right? Usually, but you had you had the weird tank controls where you held right on the controller and your guy would spin, right?
Yeah.
And then you press up and he would move forward. That's kind of a Resident Evil thing. That's kind of the thing what makes it. I think the difficulty in controlling your character in Resident Evil is part of the survival aspect of the game, right?
Yeah.
The lack of mobility. When 4 came out, and 4 came out probably like maybe in the early 2000s, right? Or something around there. And that was when, the age of first person shooters was coming out. Like the Call of Duties were coming out, the Battlefields were coming out. And so, to survive in this market, Capcom was like, well, we have Resident Evil. People know this brand, right? They know this brand. They know what to expect. But we also need new clients and new people to play our game. So we're going to combine the two a little bit and make it more action-based with some storylines from Resident Evil, right? I mean, they use a character, Leon Kennedy, from Part 2 in Part 4, right? He's now more mature. He's looking for the president's daughter, right, in this weird Spanish villa, right? But it's definitely more action based versus I would say it's more thriller and action than horror. And then that can kind of be weird because what kind of makes horror in video games, right? And I think it's the helplessness of your character. You notice in some games, if you're like a character that is fully equipped, is like armed to the teeth, it's not as scary as if you're a reporter with the only camera that you have is a weapon, right?
Yeah.
A flashlight. So, and I think that's what makes it a big difference with horror games. And also the uneasiness of what you're seeing in front of you is you can't understand it, right?
Yeah.
And a game that does this very well is like Outlast and Silent Hill, because your brain tries to decipher, what am I looking at here? And if you have to say that, I think they're doing a good job, right? So I think that's good. But to go back to your question, yeah, so it was just an experiment to change in formula to get more people to play, right? And it worked for the most part, right? Newcomers and oldcomers came together and played Resident Evil 4. They could say it's a great success. And so with 5, they go, well, how do we top that? Well, let's add 2 players to that, right? Let's do 2 people playing the game together, but it's still similar to 4, right? So they tested that a little bit, and it did actually pretty well because 4 did so well. They're riding the coattails of 4, and then in 6 they doubled down. Actually, 6 is the most expensive Resident Evil they've ever made. They put a lot of money into that game, and you can see that when you play it, but it kind of lost the spirit of Resident Evil, right? The whole point of Resident Evil was like you're like the special forces guy. You got put in this unusual place, and you're kind of helpless because you don't have a lot of bullets, right? You're by yourself. Your friends are missing. In 6, it's like World War Z. So there's like that spirit of Resident Evil is missing. But I mean, one can argue that was kind of like the peak of Resident Evil's story, right? Like the events that happened in the first game, this is where it's going to end in 6. Right, so that could be an argument, but a lot of gamers don't see it that way, and I think they have the right to, because when you think of Resident Evil, you think of something specific. Like, for example, you think of a Friday the 13th movie. There's a specific formula to those movies, right? Same thing with video games. I have an expectation of playing a certain game if I hear the title of that. And then, for example, if you played a Mario game, right, and you ended up being a first-person shooter, that'd be super awkward, right? So, like, you didn't expect that, and so that's kind of what happened with Resident Evil, which is why in Resident Evil 7 they went back to the classic horror where you're just normal guy that goes into this like creepy village, right? So, and they made it more exciting because your guy's not like a special forces guy, just normal dude looking for his fiance. Yeah. So, and I think that's part of that. And then that's really they're at this point in the series where what do we do next? Because we're kind of going back to the formula. Well, now we're going to have to ramp it up a little bit, of course, change it just a little bit. But how do we integrate the rest of the series and back into that, right? So they have a very difficult task ahead of them. Now, and you're talking about Resident Evil 3 remake, right?
Hmm.
2 and 3 were actually, I think, made very similar together. I think 3 only came out less than 2 years than the first one, than 2. So because they already had the resources and assets to make 3. Because if you think about it, in Resident Evil 2, and when they made 3, they already had the same assets back in the 90s to make 3, which is not much different from each other. Kind of
Yeah.
the same. The history repeated itself with this one. They made 3, and so a lot of gamers are actually saying that 3 isn't as good as 2, which I think they're right to say that, just because that, when you're a gamer that played Resident Evil Remake 2, you're like, wow, this is totally different than what I saw in the second one. But then when you beat it and you play it, and you play the sequel, you're like, you're kind of already lost that like charm already. Now you expect it to be a little bit more different. And it was a little bit too close to what it was, and I think that's why 3 isn't as welcome as 2 is. So I don't know if Lucas, have you experienced anything different than that?
Yeah, that's interesting. And actually, yeah, Lucas, I want to get your opinion, because you kind of, like, we started out this episode where you were talking about it means a lot to you because you were gifted Resident Evil as a kid. So, and that's kind of what the horror genre in video games meant to you. So what do you think personally about these remakes? Because you are coming from this place kind of in your heart about the Resident Evil franchise. Do you feel good about these remakes, or would you prefer the originals just as they are?
There's actually an interesting, perfect answer to that. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of the Resident Evil series. I spent a lot of time playing it and a lot of time thinking about it. And James brings up a lot of interesting points. So there was a remake for the GameCube of the original Resident Evil, which kept the slow tank controls. It kept a perfect visual upgrade from the original game. And they added a few more things on top for a little twist for veteran players. And it was absolutely fantastic if you were a huge Resident Evil fan. If you were a new player, it felt clunky and weird because it had these old school mechanics for a very modern and pretty looking game.
Mm-hmm.
The more recent remakes have taken that and applied modern day graphics, but particularly with the remake of Resident Evil 2, they're remembering what drew people to those original 3 games, and they're introducing that one element that has been left behind from Resident Evil 4, and that's horror. And so an important aspect of horror is giving the player just enough control that they know that they're helpless. And Resident Evil 1 and 2 were great for this because there's more enemies than you had bullets. But you had bullets and you could kill enemies. So you had to kind of pick and choose who was worth it, who was not. This guy might be scary, but do I risk running around him to save the bullets for something I don't know that's in the future? So from that, I'm a huge fan of the remakes. They've done an excellent job. With only a small caveat. So James mentioned that Resident Evil 2 and 3 were released at around the same time, or within short order, and he's right about that. But Resident Evil 3, I think one of the reasons it wasn't as well received is because it started introducing more action at the cost of the horror.
Mm-hmm.
And they introduced Nemesis, which was this big bad monster that could chase you from screen to screen, which was a great element. And it added a lot of terror and fear to the game when he was there. But they also upped the action. And so instead of running around and dodging zombies and really being immersed in this world for a long period of time, you would do something exciting and then a giant monster would blow in through a window and you just have to run like crazy. So it spiked up your adrenaline, but you lose the immersion. You're just kind of running away from this thing. And the remake of Resident Evil 3 does the same thing. It's, again, exciting for the first couple times you play, and then after a while you learn what the beats are for the big monster, and you're just kind of running through the course. It's still a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But I'm a little concerned that in the future they're beginning to fall into the same holes that they fell into back in the late 90s.
Interesting. So we're still talking about Resident Evil, and so you guys are really like hardcore immersed into the video game world. Now, I played them a few times. I can't remember. I think the last time was maybe a couple years ago. I was playing with my wife, and she was screaming at me as we were trying to play this game together. And I like to run and gun. It's just what I do in video games. So I'm shooting all these zombies and trying to do all this stuff. And she's kind of following the storyline because she gets obsessed with, like, what do I need to do? And so she goes, where the hell are you, Joe? And I'm off maybe 100 feet away or so outside the building, just shooting and having a good time. And she's like screaming at me and like hitting my leg and everything like that. And so that's kind of like where I'm coming from. So I've seen the movies. So just to kind of round it about, I've seen the movies. I enjoy the movies as you did, James. You can't take them seriously because they're just fun. But to me, they seem very different than what the games are themselves. Let's start over with you, Dave. You nodded earlier. I think you have some particular experience with the Resident Evil films as well. I want to start with you. How do you feel about the transition or the adaptation of the video games towards the movies themselves with the Resident Evil franchise?
You mean going from the game to the movie?
Yeah, because they seem vastly different. So how is your perspective on that?
Well, I must admit, I've never really been into the films that much. But years ago when I was doing a lot more gaming, I was playing a lot of the Resident Evil games. I thought the lack of control over the character made the game way scarier than it was, because like if something starts coming after you, you're gonna get stuck on stuff, and it's kind of like it feels like you're in constant panic mode because of it. But the movies, they didn't really do it for me. The first one was great, and then after that, I don't know. They just didn't. They seemed dry or bland.
we gotta man. So it's interesting that you did like the first one, but you weren't. I was actually more of a fan of the second one than I was the first one. Mia Jovovich plays Alice in it. Yep. I thought she looked hot throughout all of them. I mean, but that wasn't the basic thing. I thought part two really broke things open and made it a bigger world, and that's what. But I was looking at it as a kind of a B movie fan. So moving on to back over to actually, let's go over to Mariana. And so, have you had much experience with the video games in themselves, and how do you feel about the movie transition?
So I've actually never seen the movies.
That's
My
good.
God, why did I even go back over?
Why did you? I'm
Don't
just
know
here
why.
to look at four handsome faces
Like,
for an hour.
No, Mariana is on. Yeah, no, I know. I appreciate Mariana. Before I smash her down into a little.
I have played the game, and I've watched a lot of the game played more than I've played it, though. And, I have to say that I agree with one thing specifically that all of you have said, and that's, like, you feel like you're just enough in control to feel that limitation.
Feel out of control. So just enough in control to feel out of control.
Yeah. And that mostly came from going through corridors. First of all, just FYI, I get lost in any map. It doesn't matter if it's just one hallway or what, I will get lost in that map. It doesn't matter. So,
gets lost
a lot of the game.
Bathroom and living room at night.
What was that?
It happened twice.
And I think you get lost between your bathroom and your living room every night. Short distance, ladies and gentlemen.
Short distance, short-term memory. It's a well.
Do I live here?
But going back to that, I think Lucas watched me play a little bit of it. He let me play it, and I was just going through these hallways, opening doors, and suddenly these fucking zombies would come out of nowhere. So I would just I don't know what happens to me in video games, but
Panic.
what happens specifically is that I start panicking right away. So when you have a game that's specifically made to make you panic, it just amplifies that. So I'm just
Deer in
going in
headlights, that's
circles,
all.
running into walls and stuff, and then trying to melee everything in the way and then get away at the same time.
You're just scrambling all over the place and you're running and screaming. So it's kind of like every time I go over there to visit you and then you're trying to cook or something and then you're scrambling and screaming.
Yeah, I'm a scrambler. I'm like the I Leroy Jenkins in, but then I scramble out of there.
She like pushes a button and forgets to let go of it.
Yeah.
Well, actually, funny story. Yes, but also even in first-person shooters, I will mostly 90% of the game melee because I forget I have.
You forget you have a gun?
I forget that I can just shoot them from far away because I usually just run in.
Of the game is called first-person shooter.
Right.
And you forget the shooter word. There's 3 words: first-person shooter.
It also doesn't help.
This is a first
It also does not help when you decide not to wear your glasses, stand really far from the TV, and then ask the person you're living with to tell you which one is the ammo in your inventory, and them telling you have no ammo. Okay? But in fact, I had all the ammo. All of the inventory was ammo, but I had this idea in my head that I had no ammo. So I went through most of Dead Space, just whacking the crap out of every alien that came by. And Luca's can attest to this.
I can actually, and it's not even that she just whacked a couple aliens and we all had a laugh. She was making legitimate progress in the game, beating every enemy to death with her gun.
Yeah,
that's pretty good.
It's impressive after a
First
while.
scrambling around.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive for Dead Space. Not gonna lie, that's like using a knife in Resident Evil. It's like that's pretty
Right?
good. Yeah,
It takes a skill all its own.
yeah.
It wasn't until Lucas came in and was like, "Why aren't you just shooting them?" And I was like, "I have no ammo." He says,
Yeah.
"Open the inventory." And he's like, "You have all this ammo," and that's when I quit playing the game. I never even finished that game because I was so done.
It's funny
I
that
thought it
you
was like
bring
BioShock, where you just get a melee tool and you try to find bullets.
It's funny that Dead Space is brought up because that has the same problem. That had the same problem as Resident Evil, where it kind of lost its original spirit from the first game all the way to the third. So, and it's
the third.
The third is like Resident Evil 5. It was just an action game. It was, yeah. I don't even think the main character from the other 2 was in it, like until the end. So it was just like, and I know why they did that way. I understand, but it's just like it seems like these horror games have that same they fall into that same pitfall. Like what you said, Joe. Like they're trying to cater to the mainstream, right, versus the fans.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's happening is that they dilute the original vision to kind of adhere to the more mainstream scene, right? So, and I feel like if you're gonna jump into a movie like that or a game like that, just play the source material, watch the source material first, right? So you can appreciate the newer stuff even more, or not appreciate it. Maybe it was just really bad, like you said. Nightmare on Elm Street wasn't that great because since you watched the original source stuff, you're like you could compare. But if you were a first-time viewer of Nightmare on Elm Street, you might think that movie was great, right? But you're also missing out on the original stuff, right?
That's a good point. Yeah. I try not to talk too much shit about movies because for that point, actually, and aside from what I just said there, yeah, maybe there was some, young kid that saw that film and thought it was something quite special to them. Yeah. So that is an interesting thing to keep in mind and keep at heart. I want to move on here. So we've been talking about Resident Evil quite a bit. I think we should maybe start talking about some of what our favorite video games in general are, or just some things that kind of pop up into mind. Because I want people to be able to know about more video games that exist that they can go out and play and everything like that. So personally, I'll start out and then I'll move back over to Mariana. And then we'll just kind of work down Mariana, David Newton, James on, and then Lucas there. So there's this really cool one that I've been playing. It's on Steam. So I'm very technologically regressed. I'm not good at this.
Good word.
Yeah,
Yet
right.
you run a video podcast.
I do, and yet I do this. I know how to press the 3 buttons that the thing tells me to do. It's like, oh, I can hit R1 and R1's not. No, that's my PS4. See, I can figure that out.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
I don't know. So, yeah, I can do this. So I do, once in a while, I'm able to kind of gain access into my Steam, even though I have to change the password every time. I forget what the password is. And I have this game, there's a few of them now, and it's called Damien, and it's kind of very much based off of the Omen films. And so you play this little kid who's growing up in this rich household, and the devil comes to you and tells you that you are his spawn, and you're going to take over the world and all this stuff. And he tells you all this messed up stuff. And so you play as this little kid in this big mansion. You go around and you don't like your dad's business partner. And so you go, because he blows smoke from cigarettes in your face. And so what you do in the game, what you have to do is you have to go over into first you have to take his matches and throw those away. And then you go over into the kitchen and you go jimmy rig the oven so that, because you know that if he doesn't have the matches, he'll go over to the oven to go try to light his cigarette on this gas oven. And so you make it, and so the business partner has to go over into the kitchen and try to light a cigarette, and then all of a sudden the gas explodes and catches him on fire and he dies, and you're very happy because you're an evil little shit. And you're walking along the hallways and you start feeling kind of weak, like you've eaten something bad, but then you look up and there's this crucifix on the wall, and since you're pure evil, this crucifix is hurting you. So you have to use your telekinesis to turn it upside down, and then all of a sudden you feel great. You're like, yay! And there's 3 of those, so I haven't gone through the first one yet, and I'm really excited for the second 2. So those are probably my favorite video games at the moment, because I really do like the Omen films as well, and this really follows it just to the letter, just from what I've played. So let's move back over to the beautiful Mariana, because that's really why people come to see this show, I think, especially after our all-nude show. They're probably like, Mariana! So,
More of her, please.
more of her. I should, maybe just have myself in a tiny little box and right here. Mariana, what is your favorite horror video game and why?
So my version of horror video games is more like survival games.
Okay.
And I want to talk about 2. One is my very favorite to play at 1 in the morning with the headphones on, just complete sensory overload on this game. And I actually, I allowed myself to do something that I never do. So the game is Don't Starve. And you can also play Don't Starve together. So this is it's a survival game. It's really just it's wilderness, and you there's, back to the point of not having many resources, you have a shit ton of stuff that you can craft, but you have to grind all day, and depending on who your character is, you have to be strategic about it. So this game, 2 reasons that put it into the horror category for me. One is the art is awesome. It kind of looks like Tim Burton art.
Yeah,
I don't know if any of you guys have played it. I know James played it with me and Calvin. Lucas, you've played it, right?
Yeah, we played it together.
And
Turkey?
then, huh?
Turkey?
Oh yeah, damn turkey is. Dave, have you played it?
I have not, but I did watch somebody else play it.
Yeah, it's definitely, it gets fun because you have to try not to starve, main point of the game. There's also a health bar, but also there's a sanity bar. And the more insane you go, you start seeing these shadows at night, but then you start seeing them during the day. And if you go more insane, this is the thing that I never allow happen, is to go completely insane. But I allowed it. You don't die from insanity, from losing insanity. And you can be attacked by these shadow creatures. And the noises that come out during the night, even when you're sane, is just especially if you have the headphones in, it's creepy. Like the the noises, the music, it's all insane, insanely creepy and scary. The other game I want to talk about is actually one that's going to be coming out. The first part was out. It's called The Last of Us. It's also a survival game. The Last of Us 2 is coming out on the 19th of this month. It's I plan on playing it on the PS4. It's basically, I don't know if anyone's played the first one, but this is 5 years later, and Ellie and Joel have settled down in a community, and this horrific, tragic thing happens, and they have to, Ellie, and I think Lucas specifically would appreciate the fact that Ellie is, you know, she's the head, the character. So she's female character. I know Lucas is very supportive of that. I'm sure everyone is. But she has to survive through this like post-apocalyptic world with, you know, infected people. It's like kind of like post-apocalyptic zombie kind of thing. And the really cool thing is that they did a really awesome job. They did like 20 minutes of gameplay online. They advertised. And you can see the cityscape of Seattle like completely redone. Like you can tell, stop laughing at me. But you can tell like it's not just the current construction and the Ferris wheel and the Space Needle, but you also have like new construction, but it's a literal urban jungle because it's, you know, it's 5 years after an apocalypse has happened.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Does the first one take place in Seattle?
No, they're moving like constantly, and
Okay.
I think that's actually a pretty good theme in a lot of like of horror movies in general, is just like constantly moving or you die.
Joe, have you ever seen the movie The Road with Viggo Mortensen?
Yes.
Love that film. It's a beautiful film.
It's like loosely based on that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's an escort from one portion of the country to the other. You know, usually a male lead with like a young child, right?
Yeah.
And then of course the obstacles are either crazy humans, zombies, right? Mad Max world kind of thing.
Some cannibals here and there.
Yeah, just like that.
Yeah, I mean, just circle it back around to movies. Go watch The Road. Beautiful film. The performances will knock your socks off. But let's get back to Mariana. So Last of Us. Continue talking about The Last of Us because you're very excited about this.
Yeah, because I like survival games, right? Like Dead Space is basically a survival game. And then Don't Starve, survival game. This one I really like because you get to do some things that I think kind of get dismissed in a lot of media in general today, which is playing as a girl, for example.
Yeah.
That reaches a whole new audience, and also, but it also kind of like, you know, pulls back some people from playing games when the main character is female. The other thing is like this is a pursuit of justice that Ellie goes on. The mission, yes, you have to survive, but that's just like in the back of your head. The storyline, as at least as I've seen it from like the 20 minutes of gameplay that they showed and all of the reviews that I've seen, that it just seems like the story can really capture you and like make you feel that like you're on her side, you know, not just as the player playing, you know, you're not just immersing yourself as the player, but also as like a pursuit of this justice over the terrible thing that has happened at the camp at the beginning of the game.
Mm-hmm. You know,
kind of like a Final Girl thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that sounds awesome. And I can, you know, knowing Mariana and who she is, it kind of seems like she is preparing for the end of the world.
No, I have nothing in here that could prepare me for the end of the world.
Yeah, well, maybe not the food and stuff. Well, she's a very good cook. I can tell that. She made burgers a couple weeks ago. Damn, they were really good. I'm going to go near her sushi because she had some incident the other day, I think. But she has swords, as you can see in the background there. She knows how to ride a motorcycle, which I can't. So I can't swing a sword. I can't ride a motorcycle. So it kind of seems like at least like for those things, she's kind of preparing because she's a pretty badass chick. I'll tell you what, though, I'll probably tag along and I'll just bring a bunch of cans of beans and I'll open those for us as we're going.
Actually, I do need help because my whole life I thought about being in a post-apocalyptic dystopian world of some sort, and I always imagined myself on the motorcycle, like pulling out this like half like sawed-off shotgun and like shooting zombies as we're riding down. Here's the problem. That's where the right side is where the throttle is, okay, and the brake. So I never really learned to do it with my left hand. So I'm going to need you to sit in the bitch seat and shoot things.
You know, it works for me. Yeah, I mean, if you could take over and kill all the zombies, I'll be the bitch in the back because you're much more badass than I am.
Okay, well then we'll just put you in a basket in the front.
Yeah, I'll be
like a spear.
Give him a little bell.
Let's move on down to Lucas real quick. What is your favorite video game a horror video game rather that's come out over the years? I think you kind of established it with Resident Evil and stuff like that, but kind of what's with your second one? Just one of your favorites, and talk about it a little bit.
So as much as I love Resident Evil, it actually got usurped for my favorite horror game of all time by Alien Isolation.
Oh, tell me about that because I really want to watch that. I'm a big Alien Ridley Scott fan. I have all sorts of books. I've seen all the movies. I love that, but I just haven't really dug into the video games too much. A little bit because there's a couple kind of crappy games that I tried, and they just didn't kind of work for me, except for this Alien versus Predator game that they had in this arcade in Seattle at the bus station when I was a kid. And I was 13, 14, and I would show up there, and I always had to be there because my dad would have to like come pick me up, but I'd always have to wait for 2 or 3 hours. So I'd make sure I had $10 worth of quarters so I could play this game, and it was a side scroller. And so you could play as a predator killing all these aliens, or you could play as a colonial marine. I always preferred Predator, obviously. So tell me about Alien Isolation.
So Alien Isolation is an incredible masterpiece of survival horror. The studio that developed it actually got in touch with the studio that developed the original Alien, and I think Aliens, and they sent over terabytes of studio data and like lore information so that when this game was developed, it would look, sound, and feel just like you were in an Alien game or in an Alien movie. So much so that you actually play as Amanda Ripley, the daughter of the titular character from the first Alien film. And what I love so much about this game is it falls into that perfect blend of survival horror where you have bullets, but not many, nowhere near enough. You've got enemies that are more resistant and it's easier to get around, but they're more scary. And of course, you've got the alien, which you can't kill, but you can kind of drive off. But this is the only survival horror game I've seen that introduces a new element that most other games and films can't capture. That would exist in this real scenario, and that's endurance. I can play through and beat most horror games in about 10 to 15 hours the first time through. That's about how long they're designed to be. It took me almost 30 to beat Alien Isolation.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's not a grindy game. It's all narrative. And so you find yourself in the eyes of Amanda Ripley as every single attempt fails. Again and again, and a new plan, and then that one fails, then a new plan, and that one gets subverted, and the exhaustion of just endlessly being in this scenario begins to weigh on you, the player, and give you a sense of how the character must feel to almost, it would almost be easier just to give up.
Mm-hmm.
Just to lock yourself in a bunker and hope that rescue comes. To be one of those side characters in other horror movies that you don't appreciate because you don't remember that they've been living through the zombie apocalypse for 3 weeks, but yeah, if you're a fan of Alien, it's literally Alien the game, done perfectly.
Yeah, I've been meaning to get that for quite a while now, but as most people know, I don't play that many video games. I usually just play Call of Duty once in a while. I'll come home and I'll shoot some shit for about an hour.
You ever played the zombie Nazis in the World War II Call of Duty?
Oh, yeah. I played that a lot. I really enjoy that.
I couldn't keep up with those waves.
Oh, you get crazier and crazier. You just keep coming at you, and then you get all these German people like or there's like this voice, like this German voice yelling German words at you, like you don't know what's going on. But yeah, I used to play that. I still play that all the time because I have all the different Call of Duty games, and I just love shooting zombies. So like, I don't really follow the story. That's another one of those things where my wife is yelling at me all the time, trying to go through the story, and I'm just sitting there shooting all this shit. And I think there's this game, Left 4 Dead, that I was playing with my brother and everything, and I was sitting there. I was on Steam, and he said, "Hey, you want to play this?" So I'm sitting there trying to play, but I'm also drinking maybe too many PBRs. And so I'm getting a little slurry and just kind of running around shooting some stuff. And him and my cousin are running out over doing the storyline, and then they're yelling at me to go do this thing. And so I'm trying to follow them, and they say, go up over into this tower thing. I can't even remember what it was. So I go over there, and I'm like, okay. I've been shooting all these zombies. I'm going up here. And they're all of a sudden they're running off and they're taking off in a helicopter, I think. And while all these zombies are coming at me, like, thousands of feet away, I'm like, where are you guys going? And all of a sudden I see this little thing up in the corner that says martyr trophy. I'm like, why do I have a trophy for being a martyr? Because they had sacrificed me so that they could get away on this whole map. And I'm like, you sons of bitches. But I'll tell you what, they don't have the martyr trophy. I do. They knew that was going to happen, but I take it as a win.
Did you have fun? I mean, that's what matters, right?
I did. And then I went and crashed because I was way too drunk.
Nice.
So let's cut back over to James there. So let's talk about kind of like what is one of your favorite video games of all time and why?
We're strictly sticking with horror, right? Because there's way too many. Okay, cool.
Big question otherwise.
You don't understand how many times I get asked this question, right? But I would say one of my favorite horror games of all time is a game called Shadows of the Damned. Anybody know? Does anybody know this game?
No, I don't know that one.
Okay, all right. So this game was actually made by Electronic Arts, the ever popular publisher that releases all the football games and
their reputation precedes them.
Yeah, the Battlefield games. But there's this little game here is a very, very unique game. Okay, and I'm gonna paint this game for you guys, right? Because not a lot of people know about this game. So think of the Fonz, right? The way the Fonz looks. Yeah. And look at Bruce Campbell, Ash, right? Combine those two, the charisma of and the kind of like the what do you call it? The cheekiness of Ash, right? Yeah. And then the charisma of the Fonz. That's the character. So I'm just gonna read really briefly the plot of this game. Because,
okay, cool.
But that's your main character, right? So the demon hunter Garcia Hotspur comes home to find his girlfriend Paula being abducted by the Lord of Demons, Fleming, who brags that he will take Paula with him to kill her again and again. Garcia is powerless to stop Fleming, but instead follows him back to the underworld along with his demon sidekick, Johnson, who also acts as his gun, torch, and motorcycle. Right? It sounds insane. So think of a guy with a slick hair, leather jacket, a Magnum revolver named Johnson that talks to him, right? In the shape of a phallic item, which is amazing. And I would say the way this game is portrayed is like Kill Bill. If you mixed Army of Darkness and Kill Bill together, you get the style of this game. Kind of like that old school style of kind of cheesy and horror at the same time. And it plays like Resident Evil 4. So the camera's behind you, you have bullets and stuff like that. Your gun actually transforms into other guns depending on which demons you kill in the underworld, right? Nice. There's a lot of penis jokes because it's all about a gun named Johnson.
Oh,
right?
That's perfect for me.
Yeah, and I feel like, and it's been a long time, but I feel like all the demons are like rock stars, right? They're like demons, but they kind of have like rock star motifs to them. And then you're this guy that's like a rockabilly guy, right? On a motorcycle driving through hell trying to get your girlfriend back from the devil. So it's pretty funny. And And I think this is one of my favorite horror games because have you ever heard of a game another like this? Right? It's very unique. And it takes like comedy, horror, and like I feel like when I had a good time playing it pretty much from start to finish. It's definitely going to be more on the action side. It's not going to be as scary, but I think because the humor kind of took that away from it. It's definitely gory, but like I said, it's like Kill Bill and Army of Darkness combined, and it's only out on the PS3 and the 360. And I've never seen any game like it before. So if when you guys get a chance, just YouTube like a trailer for it, and it just makes you want to play the game. And I totally had a blast with that. But that's one of my favorite horror games right now. But the game that I'm consistently playing though, especially with my viewers, is Dead by Daylight. As you can see behind me, that's kind of the footage that we have back there. Mariana and Joe saw me play this together with him while we were chatting, and you know it's about a game, the game called The Entity, right? And the Entity kidnaps humans in our world that no one cares about, pretty much. So like no one's gonna miss you, so I'm just gonna take you into my game, and then the killers in the game were human before that had unfortunate events happen to them, and so now they're being resurrected as a killer to kind of enact a revenge, right? So the entity is playing a game, right? Letting kind of like your desires go through, and all the victims are people that no one cares about. But it's a multiplayer game that really has no story. It's just a game that you play over and over again, kind of like the Friday the 13th game. But the fun part about it, I think, is there's a lot of different varieties of how to kill, and there's a lot of different survivors that you can pick, right? And it becomes this cat and mouse game, and there's not really much you can do as a survivor but hide, run away, and kind of like trick the killer. And your job is to open these generators until you open 5 of them, and then the gates to the exit will open. And then the killer, of course, has to find them, hang them up 3 times, and then they get sacrificed to the entity. So it's kind of like that over and over again. So even though I wouldn't call it my favorite game, but it's a game that kept me hooked, no pun intended. And it's something that I think anybody that's either a casual or like a long-term gamer can enjoy, because if you don't like playing as the killer, you can always play as survivor, because they both play totally differently. So there's 2 ways to play the game. Right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on over there to David Newton, and we're going to kind of finish this out with our Dave's favorite horror video game of all time, and then let's kind of go down through the list after that. Kind of maybe our most favorite movie based off of a video game. But let's go over to Dave's favorite video game in the first place.
That would be I spent almost 3 years playing Friday the 13th, the game, constantly, and I really feel like that game was underrated. And at first I was like, wow, this game kind of sucks, it's a little slow, but actually it grew on me a lot. It's a third-person survival horror game. There's 8 players on each map. One person gets to be Jason, the others are the counselor. And basically the object is that Jason tries to kill as many of the counselors as he can before the time runs out, or the counselors can escape and they win. And one thing I liked about the game was in a lot of these horror games, you're the protagonist, and all the enemies are AI and kind of dumb or whatever, but when you actually put a person inside Jason, they're able to devise strategies and think of ways they can catch you. And as Jason, you get a couple powers. You can detect people who are near you, and you can teleport anywhere on the map. So if you're a counselor, like, you don't have a lot of time to figure out what you're going to do or get a weapon or run away, because he'll just show up like right there, just like the movies, and you're like, oh my god, he's right there, and then you like run away. And I play that game so much, and it's very heavily melee based, so you don't have to shoot anything. And I ended up playing so much of the game that it stopped being scary after a while. So then I started playing Animal Crossing, and that fucking game is terrifying. I swear to God. There's like cannibals in that game and shit.
Cults
like
and
cows
stuff,
like
yeah.
laying on top of cowskin rugs and yeah, so that was my favorite game.
I'm glad you brought up Friday the 13th, the video game, because obviously I played that. I was anxious to play that video game before it came out, and I remember reading about it maybe a year beforehand. And I was just waiting and waiting. I was like, please, please, God, make this a real thing for me. Because I remember growing up playing the Nintendo version, and the Nintendo version, one of the most son of a bitch video games of all time, where you're running around Camp Crystal Lake as a counselor. And there's different obstacles that are showing up. You have to, all of a sudden, Jason's mother pops up out of nowhere as this like sea wench, or like her head shows up, and then these sea wench people show up, and then you have to go in these cabins, and you have to go make sure that you're saving all of these counselors before they die, which of course I think is impossible unless you're a freak that can play this game. I've actually seen somebody, like one person win it on a YouTube video one time, and I was like, I don't believe it. I can't possibly believe that. Because I played this, and the game would stress me out, and it would scare me. It would actually scare me, because so you go into these, like, first person, going into this, you found out where where this counselor would be, or a camper would be, and you go in there to go save the camper, and then you're looking around this cabin, and all of a sudden, Jason will show up and just, like, fucking kill you, and you're toast. And then you have to restart the whole thing over. So you might be lucky to kind of get a little further than a few cabins, and then go underground to this like underground like river and find all these like sea wenches jumping up and killing you and everything like that. So, however,
that game is the only game that made me actually nerd rage. Like I could not, I couldn't survive at all. And then like eventually I was like, "Fuck this shit! I hate this game." Like run off.
All the time, but then you always go back because Jason looks so cool in that game. He looks so cool in that game that they actually came out with Nintendo version shaped. Looking toys, and I really want one of those. I wish I had, but they came out with them real quick. They sold out, and now they cost a fortune. But so the new one, yeah, I did actually play the Friday the 13th, the new one. I have it on my PS4, so once in a while I'll jump on there, and I enjoy it. But mainly for the nostalgia factor, I don't find it that friendly of a player interface. But I do jump on there and I run around because I don't care for games where I can't keep playing. Like you get killed real quick and then you wait for maybe 20 minutes to jump back into it. Yeah. So you have to be in a particular mindset to play that game. I do enjoy it, enjoy the graphics. And, Kane Hodder actually worked on the video game himself, and he designed a lot of the kills because he is one of the greatest stuntmen of all time, on top of actually playing Jason Voorhees 4 times, starting in my favorite Friday the 13th film, Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. So I'm glad you brought that up. We could actually probably do a whole new podcast just on that particular game alone. I think
bring it up in the Friday the 13th podcast that we're gonna do.
Yeah, and we do plan on doing the Friday the 13th podcast. I kind of want that to be. I kind of want to do like one episode per movie because I really want to dig in on those things. So one last thing before we all end up going, and I want to go around the circle real quick. Mariana, could you please tell me your favorite movie based off of a video game?
Okay. No, I can do the other way.
Okay, well, let's do your favorite. She's always contradicting. She's. I ask these questions. What is going on here?
Sorry.
Every time. And I suppose that we should really call this the Devil's Advocate podcast or the Opposites podcast, because I asked you something, you said, "Well, go fuck yourself, Joe," and I'll answer a question that I wanted. Sure.
Well, if we were more organized, maybe, but we don't have. We're too lazy to be organized. So
Okay. Well, okay. So ask your question and then please answer that.
ask my own question and answer it. What's my favorite video game adapted from a movie?
Yes.
It's not even horror related.
Holy Jesus. Now we're just like.
It's your fault for making these questions so vague.
Well, I don't think that was a vague question. I really do. Okay. This will be the exception as we back over to Mariana here, because she is the exception in general in life. So
I am.
could you please phrase your non-horror related video game question and as to how you're going to answer it, and then give us your very lovely answer, because that's why people are.
We're gonna Jeopardy this.
Uh-huh. No.
My favorite favorite video game adapted from a movie is actually the Lego version of the Jurassic Park movies.
Oh, you're like going like direct to DVD sort of like.
But okay, but I will say that I did really like. God, I always like mix up the names, but there is this movie called The Gamer. Or
Oh
Gamer.
yeah. Just
it's
Gamer.
the one where like death row inmates can be like AI'd into these. Well, they're actually physically there in these like first-person shooter video games, and if like the player helps them survive, that they're able to get out of prison. So movie-wise, that one is my favorite.
Okay, I like that. So since we've gone off the rails, as we all
As always.
Let's just say, what is your favorite video game themed movie and or movie based off a video game? And actually, Gamer's a badass film. You're a badass chick, so I accept it.
Okay.
Even though
you got the answer right, by the way. The question is correct.
I still don't know what the hell you're talking about, and we're in a different ballpark. But at least I'm kind of picking up on what the game is that we're playing. I think kind of it's like we've gone from like baseball to basketball over to
sports ball.
Sports ball.
Good thing this isn't a sports podcast.
Mutant football over here, but I think I get that rule. I think I know what's going on. Okay, so let's go down.
I just like to push the boundaries of the rules, right? To know my limits.
Of logic.
Yeah.
Yes. Lucas, tell me, since we've gone out of the park, just start talking, I guess.
Keeping it in a relative theme, to answer your actual question, as much as I kind of hate to say it would be the first and only the first Resident Evil movie, because to me that's a pretty decent horror film. My love of the Resident Evil games didn't allow me to enjoy the later Resident Evil films. My nerd rage just destroyed any chance of even not taking them seriously. But I always felt like the first one was a pretty solid horror film. Oh yeah, it was a B horror film.
Yeah.
It was still a fun horror movie. And I still think back to that laser grid splitting into like 36 little squares and cutting the guy into tiny bits. So it had memorable kills, which I think is important in any kind of B horror movie.
That's awesome. That's a great answer. Let's move on over to David Newton.
Yeah, mine would have to be Silent Hill. I had a lot more fun with the movie than I did the games. It was so dark, and then the soundtrack. What's his name? It's like Akira's. I can't remember his last name. I should have looked it up.
Yeah.
But anyway, he did all the music for it, for both the movie and the game. So I thought that really helped hang on to the, I guess, the feel of the games. But that's it, the Silent Hill.
I really enjoy the Silent Hill film well, the video games. The first one I enjoyed. The second one goes a little off the rails. There was even no, there's just the two, I think, of the movies. But the first one was, it kind of captured, at least for the first half, the feeling of the movie with all the fog and of the video game with all the fog and everything like that. James, favorites? We're off the video game something or other because Mariana just kind of.
I'm just the black sheep. Just don't even look at me, okay? Just
orange here, and I said, "Could you please describe this orange?" And then she put a gun towards the orange and just blew it up. So we're just kind of wherever.
Joe isn't bitter about this at all.
I'm not bitter at all. So, video game, horror, movies. Add your word here. Answer the. Give a
vague question.
So, is it favorite video game that turned into a movie?
Sure, why not?
That is the question.
Okay,
I guess that's where we are.
there's only two champions of video game movies that I appreciate. One is Street Fighter, right, and the other one's Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat is the best game to movie adaptation I've ever seen. Just because it wasn't like one. I think the main drawback, it wasn't rated R, right?
Yeah.
But I think the best
Which means there's no nudity. I prefer nudity.
yeah, and then no gore really, right? So and MK is all about that. But it just did enough of the game to movie adaptation where it was like, all right, that's close enough. I'll take it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, and that's the best one. Street Fighter was just a shit show. That's why I love it.
And Bison's
I
fantastic.
love Van Damme.
Yeah,
Give me
I mean,
Jason.
nothing like a super French American hero. I mean, that's
Yeah,
my
right?
favorite part about that. And also, I feel bad that was Raul Julia's last role in his career.
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, he went and kicked the bucket right after that.
Yeah, but he was the most poetic Shakespearean bison I've ever known in my life. So that's pretty awesome. Yeah. Other than that, they had the best Zangief actor they picked out. The casting for that movie was amazing.
I actually watched Street Fighter the movie in the movie theater, and I loved every second of it. And I think being our age, growing up in the 80s and the 90s, when we remember Street Fighter 2 coming out, that was such a big freaking thing going to school. I remember the other students and us where we're like drawing pictures of Street Fighter characters and everything like that. We'd go home or we'd go over to a friend's house that had it and we would play it for hours on end. We'd get super good at it.
Is that the same year that they invented the wheel?
Yes. Yes, I remember the wheel was like, it was a great, because before that we had to walk everywhere and our legs hurt a lot.
Uphill both ways, right?
She was referring to street fighting, not Street Fighter the game.
Straight from Street Fighter to the video game.
Yeah.
It's Olden's over here. All right. Well, I really appreciate that. I think this was a really great podcast, a really great episode. And I hope everybody that has been watching this entire time has enjoyed it. I would really love it if all of us, the five of us, came back kind of for another episode about video games, because I think there's so much that we didn't crack as far as, because there's so many other games that we didn't talk about. We didn't really cover Call of Duty Zombies too much. There's the Saw video games. There's the Walking Dead video games. There's so many other ones that we didn't get to. There's this really cool one about that was kind of plotted by Clive Barker, who created Hellraiser. He did Jericho, and I'd love to get into that one.
I played that one. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. It was super cool. So I really hope that all of us come back and we end up doing this again and just kind of dig in. And maybe we can talk about more movies that are based on horror video games and not just crazy out there stories that Mariana wants to kind of like, I'll tell you what, I'm just going to kind of do my own thing. And I don't care what you guys
I have word dyslexia, so I just move the words around of the question until it becomes a question.
It becomes something. I think it really ended up turning out great. So I hope all you guys come. And so thank you for joining us at No Country for Joe and Mariana, the podcast. Again, I'm Joseph Vogely. And this is my very wonderful friend.
Hello, Mariana.
And we're the co-hosts of the No Country for Joe and Mariana podcast. Thank you, David Newton, James Hong, and Lucas for joining us for this video game. We had a lot of fun, and we're going to all come back here very soon again, because I think horror video games and the horror genre is very special. And there's so much more to talk about and really dig into. So we'll talk to you guys soon, and I hope everybody's hanging in there. All right, bye.